So Chris Mooney here has given a couple of talks here, and his talks focus around scientific communication and more specifically how poorly scientists do at communicating to the people that benefited from the most. You guys, unless you are a scientist, and I apologize, you probably suck at communicating. So more recently, Chris has been looking into the genetic, environmental, epigenetic factors that affect our political beliefs. Now, we're not a political organization. We don't take sides. We believe in evidence. And so Chris here is going to produce some of the evidence that he's found that he'll be debuting in his new book that's coming out in April. And so he's going to debut and give you a sneak peek of his new book tonight, all of the material inside of it. And so concluding his three-part mini-series on a thirst for communication, I want to welcome up to the stage our rock star, Mr. Chris Mooney.
Okay, thank you. Hey, let me have the clicker. I'm definitely gonna need the clicker. Thanks, Eric. So Eric wants me to somehow synthesize my first two talks and go further. And we were trying to think about like how to do this in soundbite form. I don't know why he doesn't understand that as a liberal, I'm constitutionally incapable of boiling down what I think into a simple message. So it's going to be difficult. But we tried, and the first thing we came up with was this. So, I mean, I think that's in the neighborhood. But it didn't have enough profanity for Eric. So then we were like, well, this is, and it's not actually that accurate to what I've been saying. It's just kind of general. So maybe this is my message. Science is the most objective way we humans can describe reality. We're really good at fucking this up. And that is kind of getting close to what I'm saying. So you guys can tweet that. Mooney said a bad word. Okay, you can put it on the record and you can get me in lots of trouble. What? Okay, tweet it now. In any case, to be a little bit more serious, what I said in the first talk was that we need to create what I called the deadly ninjas of science communication to get the word out to the benighted populace about things like evolution and climate change and all these issues where people don't accept what's true. And then in the second talk, I drill down on trying to understand why it is that people sometimes ignore what's true and what the psychological process is behind people thinking things like this, okay? People not believing that the president was born in the United States. So how am I going to bring all these things together and go farther? I mean, I got inability to communicate science and contested issues to the public. I've got people resisting scientific information. What is the common theme? What unifies it? What is the link in the chain? Well, the answer is Republicans. Yeah. I mean, who do we want to communicate science to, really, on evolution, on climate change? Who doesn't accept it? Republicans. And why don't they accept it? There's some kind of deep-set resistance there, something about who they are that makes them unwilling to believe these things and also more likely to believe these things, like President Obama is not born in the United States. So what I'm going to give you in the next 15 minutes is a summary of my argument that's going to be coming out in much, much more detail in 2 months. And here's the book, about why it is that we disagree about reality and about politics, and how these disagreements about reality and politics are grounded in a set of traits, psychological, perhaps even biological, upon which we differ, and that's the root of it all. And this is controversial stuff, so I'm bothered to put up a blog post today on my blog where you can actually read, you can link to 18 of the peer-reviewed studies that talk about the differences between liberals and conservatives. And that's scienceprogressaction.org/intersection. So I didn't make this stuff up. It's all in the peer-reviewed literature. There's a mountain of it. I'm synthesizing it, and I'm putting it into context. Because, you know, I used to misunderstand the people who disagreed with me. I used to not know what really drove them. I mean, I had this idea. Liberals always have this idea about conservatives. They're driven by money. They're driven by financial interests. Or they're driven by religion. And that was actually my argument about them in my first book, The Republican War on Science, in 2005. I'm like, why are they denying evolution? Why are they denying global warming? Well, it must be, you know, follow the money. That's what they teach us journalists. Follow the money. So it must be that ExxonMobil is funding these think tanks that so doubt about global warming because they want to protect their profits. And if it's evolution, well, it must be, religion, and therefore, the conflict is just. And this is a standard journalistic story. It's the kind that we often tell. I would now call it a political and an environmental story. Is it wrong? Not really. There's plenty of truth to it. But the problem is that it ignores what we know about the psychological underpinnings of our political differences. It kind of pretends they don't exist. It kind of treats politics as a blank slate. We know that that is not actually true anymore. We know that our political differences are grounded in something deeper than just ideas. It's not like, you could put me in a different context and suddenly because of a different life situation, I would be a Republican. I mean, maybe it's possible, but it's actually pretty unlikely because it looks like liberals and conservatives diverge on a number of traits that are prior to ideology. Things like personality, and some of these may even be rooted, at least partly, in genetics. Again, controversial stuff, but the science is mounting to suggest that this is the case. And in fact, in some way, people have always known this. I'm going to take you back to 1877. This is the playbill for a comic opera by Gilbert and Sullivan called Iolanthe. You probably don't know it, but what's really fascinating is that in here there's a verse which suggests this very idea, that somehow politics is something that we're born with. And I want to read it to you. I'm going to have to pronounce the words differently because this is 100 years ago in England, and to make it rhyme, I'm going to have to pronounce things weird. But the verse was this: nature always does contrive that every lad and every gal that's born into this world alive is either a little liberal or else a little conservative. Okay, so the idea is already there that somehow we can see liberal and conservative children. Is that true? We can see the traits in them at that age? Well, then if so, politics is about much more than ideology because they don't have ideology yet. And there's actually been published research that backs up this idea since then. Because if the divide between liberals and conservatives was just about the content of their ideas, then you wouldn't expect to find differences between liberals and conservatives in, say, the way they arrange their apartments. But you do. This has been studied. Liberals are, guess what? Messier. All right? But also, they've got more books, they've got more travel guides, they've got more CDs, and all these kind of things. Conservatives' decorations tend to be more conventional American flags, things like that. Wait a minute, is that ideology? And you wouldn't expect them to differ in preferences for art. But again, this has been shown. Liberals prefer abstract art more than conservatives. Is that ideology? You wouldn't expect them to have different senses of humor. But they clearly do. And there's actually a study showing that both liberals and conservatives think Colbert is funny, but liberals think he's a parody of conservatives, and conservatives think that actually deep down he's one of them. Now, I'm not kidding, right? This is one of the ways in which liberals are closer to reality. So we came up with a joke, and do you think that liberals or conservatives would be more likely to get this joke? Okay, so how many of you are like this? So that's not political, is it, right? But I actually think it kind of is political in a way. And the list of findings about liberal-conservative differences that have nothing to do with politics just go on and on and on. Someone who collaborated with me for part of the new book, his name is Everett Young. He's found in his research that conservatives are more likely to think the fans of rival sports teams are bad people, more likely to want to keep germs out of their bodies, and more likely to vote for a candidate for Congress who keeps his lawn neatly edged. So, again, what is this thing that we call ideology if it's appearing in all of these strange places? What is behind all this? Well, wherever these things are located, they're not in our elbows. They're going to be ultimately in our brains. And believe it or not, there is research showing brain structural differences between liberals and conservatives. This study was actually commissioned by the British actor Colin Firth. I'm not kidding, but it's peer-reviewed. And the reason he commissioned it was because he said he wanted to figure out what was biologically wrong with the people who disagreed with him. And the scientists actually found something. So what we've got is structural MRI, looking at structures in the brain, and what they find is that This is the right amygdala. And in conservatives, you're more likely to have more gray matter volume in the right amygdala. And the amygdala is sort of the fear and threat center. It conditions your life-preserving responses to danger. This is the anterior cingulate cortex, and in liberals, it tends on average to be higher, to have more gray matter. And this is your error detecting mechanism. This is what makes you stop and say, wait, don't keep doing that pattern of behavior. I need to stop and think about this and do something different. All right? We could imagine what this means, but I don't want to go there because actually the brain stuff is pretty new and we don't fully know what to make of it. But it is consistent with a body of research that is quite solid, that is from psychology. Psychology is the field that really pioneered understanding liberal-conservative differences. And there's really a mountain of research, and it's really hard to argue your way out of it now that liberals and conservatives differ in personality. And to show this, I need a volunteer. Who would like to volunteer? You. Come on up. So I'm going to show you. Stand over there. What's your name? Devin. Devin. Now, I don't know what your politics are, and this may fail, by the way. But this is a screenshot from a study that I ran for the book. And it says, I see myself as artistic, a highly abstract thinker. Then it asks you to rate yourself from 1 to 7 in terms of how much you agree that this describes you. This is completely not, this is completely agree, and then everything in between. Where are you? You're supposed to, how much do you agree with both of them? With both of them. I agree they're a little different. So you're a 5, okay? Dependable, self-disciplined. 0? Well, you have to give us a 1 at least. So you're not dependable and self-disciplined. All right. All right, okay. All right, one more. Open to new experiences, complex. 7. You're a liberal. Am I right? Okay. Wait, aren't these questions not political? Well, I don't know that they are political, but clearly he answered in a liberal pattern, okay? Because the first and third questions detect a personality trait called openness to experience, which is highly correlated with liberalism. The middle one detected a trait called conscientiousness, or wanting order and structure in your life, which is highly related to conservatism. So you fit a very liberal pattern. Thank you very much for making me seem smart. And so the evidence on these personality patterns is pretty overwhelming. This is a study of 12,000 people conducted by political scientists at Yale. And as you can see at the top register is things that make you liberal, blue. The bottom register is things that make you conservative. And we've got the big 5 personality traits across the bottom. Conscientiousness, or order and structure. Openness to experience, we've learned about those already. Agreeableness, you can figure out what that is. Stability is the opposite of being neurotic. Okay? Extroversion, introversion, we know what that is. And then these are compared with the effect of having a high income and having a high level of education. So what makes you a liberal? Openness and a high level of education. Conservative, money and wanting structure in your life, and also a little bit more extroversion among the conservatives, so they make more friends. What does this have to do with what I'm really talking about, the fight over what's real and what's true in science and in politics? Well, I think that if you look here, this is where I would locate a lot of the conservative denial of science. This personality trait, openness. So let's talk more about what is openness. These are some slogans, there's some images that go along with openness, and this explains why liberals pay way too much money for Mac computers. People who are open to experience, they want to try new things, all right? They need to try new things. They're sensation seekers, and they're really cool with change. In fact, they like change. They want to move to different places. They want to travel the world. They're more okay with not being sure about things. They're more okay with changing their minds, nuance, uncertainty. You know, remember when George W. Bush, when he was running for president the first time, and it turned out that he had either never traveled out of the country or he traveled like once, and everyone was so shocked in the intelligentsia. How could this guy not want to go to other places? Well, because they were all open to experience, and they take it as rendered that this is something that you must do in order to be a balanced person. But Bush didn't see it that way, because that wasn't as much about him. So this strongly predicts liberalism. And what is the opposite of openness to experience? Well, the extreme opposite is not questioning authority, but respecting authority, or the right-wing authoritarian. And again, this is a personality type that has been repeatedly studied. And these are people who view the world in a more rigid way, more supportive of hierarchical structures, tend to view things in black and white, often religious fundamentalists. So what I'm saying is that these psychological differences, which reliably predict your political outlooks, are also at play in why we can't agree about what's true. How does it work? Well, one trait that you find more among the authoritarians and not so much at all among the open to experience folks is the need for closure. Need for closure is needing to have an answer, needing to have certainty about something. And if you have a high need for closure, then you engage in something that's called seizing and freezing, which is grabbing on a piece of evidence that helps you be sure about what you need to be sure about, and then you freeze. That means you don't want any more evidence. Your mind is made up, you're set, you can bank on this. Right? There's studies showing that people who deny evolution are high on need for closure. And there's a great study of the Tea Party people who deny global warming saying that they're very sure that they're right and they don't need any more information about the issue. Thank you very much. So that's a factor. I don't think it's the only factor. Another thing that we have evidence about with authoritarians is that they like to consume information that agrees with them. And in fact, there's one study of Republicans and Democrats, what kind of media do they consume, and what they gave them was fake newspaper articles that were either labeled as coming from Fox, CNN, or the BBC. And what they found was that the Republicans chose a CNN or BBC story only 10% of the time. Now, liberals or Democrats, they didn't like Fox much, but they were sort of spreading all of their media choices out more widely. It wasn't like they fixated on one place. So again, how does this explain the fight over reality in America? How does this explain conservatives denying global warming? Well, it's both that Fox sows doubt about global warming, so whenever there's a snowstorm, they say, you know, they use it as an excuse to call into question whether this is happening, even though that's a completely invalid inference. And by the way, Eric put this in my slideshow, so conservatives might find that funny. But it's not just that Fox is misinforming them, it's also that they're selecting into the information stream where it's possible to be misinformed. So it's a feedback. And it's both environmental in the sense that if Fox didn't exist, that couldn't happen, but it's also psychological in the sense that some people have a need for something like Fox. Well, if conservatives have a need for that, what do liberals have a need for? We saw before higher education. And I think that this is one of the other key factors in the fight over what's true. I mean, there's just no doubt that academia is highly liberal and science is highly liberal. Only 6% of the members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science are Republicans. I think we need a psychological explanation for this as well. Only 14% of university professors are Republican. This is a quotation. I'll take questions at the end. This is a quotation from a sociologist who studies this, Neil Gross. More so than ever before, the highly educated comprise a key constituency for American liberalism and the Democratic Party, one that may have surpassed a crucial threshold level in size. So let's go back to my big data dump. Okay, we got liberal, we got conservative, we got openness, education, money, and structure. I said a lot of the denial of reality is here, but I think a lot of it is also happening over here. And I think that if you're open to experience, I think it's pretty clear that the university is a very great place for you, because you get to try out all kinds of new things and sample different ideas. So it's like a playground for liberals. And it makes them more liberal, but it also trains them in science and the norms of science and research, and they then go on to get their advanced degrees, and then they're versed in statistics. This is something normal to them, and they're respectful of other people like them who have this background, whereas the conservatives are like, you know, we don't trust your heavily footnoted liberal garbage. And so I think and then when conservatives attack academia, it leads to even more of a feedback, and so liberals are more trusting of it, conservatives are not. So all of these things mix into a stew, and we end up with a combined psychological and environmental or cultural explanation for why we can't agree about facts, why we're divided over reality, and why conservatives believe so many wrong things. Colbert said it to George W. Bush, reality has a well-known liberal bias. This is a factually true statement. And I've explained what the reason is, and so I could cite poll after poll after poll, but I'll just give you 3 examples of this being true. In the 2010 election, Republican voters, 64% of them said they weren't sure whether the president was born in the United States. In another poll, 55% of authoritarians, but only 19% of non-authoritarians, thought Saddam Hussein had been involved in 9/11. And 18% of Tea Party members accept that global warming is caused by humans. All the rest deny it. Okay? So let me wrap up. Science describes reality. Humans are really good at ignoring this. But now we can go a little further. Some humans more than others. What does this mean? Communicating science still very, very important, but heck, we got to know what it is we're dealing with scientifically. And so that means that we have got to continue figuring out what these differences are between liberals and conservatives and how they play themselves out in the real world, because that's the only way we're ever going to have any chance of getting through, and it's the only way we're going to ever be able to depolarize either our sense of politics or our sense of what's factually true, is if we finally figure out what the real roadblocks are. And there is a lot more to be done. So I will end by saying it's time to get back to the bench and do some political science. Thank you very much. Somebody buy me a drink. To political peace. I guess I can take some questions. Anybody want to kill me?
Oh, I was just standing in the back and people are like, that guy. Seriously, him. Who's got questions for Chris?
Oh boy.
All right, you are very aggressive. Come here.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear it. Is that I work in science policy.
Choke up on the mic, please.
Excuse me. That good? I work in science policy, and one of the things that in my particular narrow area, there is a relatively good bipartisan consensus. When I
It must not be controversial then.
space policy. Space policy, is that controversial? Should we send guys to the moon? Newt Gingrich? Of course Newt Gingrich can grab somebody up to be controversial. But the thing that drives me up the wall is that we've got people who are more or less aligned in one arena, okay? You've got JFK, Democrat, very pro-space policy. Clinton, support of the space station. Reagan, support of the space station. And now all of a sudden I see somebody coming in here and says, well, you know what's really important is that we divide people. We get them to where they're fighting against each other, left, right, and center. This is a really, really counterproductive thing. If you want to divide a community, first you obviously create...
Well, this is scientific reality, and we have to acknowledge it. I mean, the amount of evidence here is massive. I'm not going to shy away from what's true because you think it's divisive.
You're going to tell me that as a practitioner in my field, that what I see day in, day out, what's been true for 20 or 30 years, that we've had a bipartisan consensus is now magically wrong. Yes,
That you had a bipartisan consensus on one area of policy doesn't prove any of this wrong.
Academic journal doesn't make it true.
Of course.
It doesn't make it
So
true.
we've got some science denial going on here.
From engineers, chemists, mathematicians, what the hell?
Any other questions?
Hey, sounds like you need to buy him a drink and then yell at him. Okay? Can we do that? Can we agree? This is about intellectual discussion, so I appreciate that. It's fantastic. Chris, choose somebody. It's all on you.
Right here, right here.
You seem very obsessed with the concept of scientific reality. Choke up on the mic? Okay. I would argue that most of us, on an individual level, are not at all in touch with reality. And
That's
very,
probably true.
And that's very adaptive. We think better things about ourselves than we actually are. We think that our relationships end not because of us, because of other people. So why do you condemn that on a social level? Because most conservative values are trying to build up this. You said it with the thinking that the fans of the opposing team are bad people. And it's the same concept, just construed on a social level.
I just don't understand the question.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm a fan of a sports team.
Yeah.
And I think I'm a better person because I like that sports team. And I think the people who root for the other sports team are wrong, are bad. In my relationship, I think I'm a better person than the person who's screwing me over.
Yeah.
I may be equally wrong on both points, but we accept me for cussing out my ex, but you're condemning...
Well, this is
people-
we're talking about public policy here, where we really need to have objective answers. I agree, everybody's a little biased in their lives, absolutely.
Okay.
But I don't...
Do you think that group selection is adaptive in any environment?
I don't know what I think about that.
Okay.
I mean, that's leaping to an area that this might lead to, but I think that gets us into really complex terrain.
He's now
I talk about that in the book.
He's now owed 2 drinks.
Yeah.
clarity that's missing here is the difference between policy and science. Policy is not an absolute. Policy has a huge amount of nuance that cannot be scientifically studied because we cannot find every outcome, right?
Sure.
So I think when we're talking about science and we're talking about personality, which is in and of itself a kind of squishy subject, you know, and then conflating it into policy, where we need to be looking at motivations and not outcomes. So actually, the space guy makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think we're raising points that are different than the points that I'm trying to make. I wrote my first book. We laid out at the beginning the difference between the facts on the ground and what policy that you reach because of them. And people often elide that difference. But I don't think that it detracts from what we're saying, which is that liberals and conservatives are different in ways that are not just political. And if we want to understand why we disagree, then we have to actually understand what it is that's driving us apart. And it turns out to be something very different from facts. It turns out to be these much more deeply rooted factors.
Talk later. Last question. We need a drink, people.
Okay, so my question isn't so much about the, I guess, heart, so much as your definitions. I guess I'm really confused why you think that liberals are automatically Democrats and conservatives are automatically Republicans. I understand that seems to be a more colloquial distinction for them, the way we talk about them in the media. But I also don't think that that's necessarily the true definition, nor the way that it's been historically.
Well, it's obviously more complicated than that.
Okay, so but you seem to think that they're the same.
No. I mean, basically, the overlap is good enough to use the terms in a talk like this because most liberals are Democrats and most conservatives are Republicans. There's also independents. We have to look at a psychological explanation for them as well. These things shift over time, and they're different in different countries to some extent. But it seems that the psychological relationship between openness, not being open, conscientiousness, and conservatism, these kind of things actually seems to bear itself out across countries. So you have both cultural changes in how people define what they call themselves, and you have political differences in terms of what's being debated in a particular point in time, but you also have a left-right spectrum showing up repeatedly in a recognizable form across countries and across eras, at least since the French Revolution. And what a lot of the research is suggesting is that it's not an accident that that happens, because these things are actually rooted in psychology, and that's what sets in motion political differences. So I think both things are true. But obviously there's going to still be a spectrum. Everybody's unique. Everybody's unique, but politics is also strongly predicted by personality.
All right. Listen, everyone, give it up for Chris Mooney. Great job. Listen, love him or hate him, buy him a drink. And how often do you get to hang out with a New York Times bestselling author? Just go sit down with him and yell at him or tell him he's awesome. Anyway, guys, we're going to take a short break. We're coming back with our final two talks. Get a drink, go to the bathroom, whatever you need to do. We're coming back in 15.